Welcome to ranked choice voting. A better way to choose, and there's a question mark after that. And we have two experts with us this evening. Associate Professor Jason McDaniel of San Francisco State University, and Steve Chessin, President of Californians for Electoral Reform. This is a League of Women Voters, Santa Clara County Civil Discourse Committee event. And with the elections upon us and the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors considering using this method for county elections, it's important to understand what it is, how it works, and the value it might add to our election systems. A couple housekeeping items to review. This event is being recorded for viewing by those who could not participate tonight, and the link will be available on our website. Please use the chat for your questions, and we will ask as many as possible later during the presentations. We are the League of Women Voters Civil Discourse Committee, and we practice and expect all to participate with empathy and respect. Lastly, we really appreciate your presence and hope you will find this event of value. So why are we doing this? The Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors is considering the use of ranked choice voting for county elections. They will be voting on that probably this month. This is an attempt to compensate for low turnout primaries where the voters are not representative of the entire electorate. We'll cover the ranked choice, what is ranked choice voting, and we'll probably talk about some other methods, why we're looking at it, what has been the experience of those who have used it, advantages and disadvantages, and we'll address as many questions as we can. And now I'm going to turn the event over to Tony Stieber, who will introduce our speakers and take the show on.
Great. Well, thank you, Marian. And I want to first introduce Steve Chessin. He is the president of Californians for Electoral Reform, and this organization educates and advocates on behalf of alternative electoral systems. Steve joined the group when it was founded in 1993. He was elected to the board and has served as president or co-president since 1999. He was the prime mover behind Santa Clara County's successful 1998 charter amendment that allows the county to use ranked choice voting in county elections. In his role with the League of Women Voters, he was partially responsible for the California League's support of ranked choice voting. Since 2015, he has been a member of the Santa Clara County Citizens Advisory Commission on Elections. Now, Steve is also a software engineer with degrees in physics from MIT and from Berkeley, including a doctorate. So a very versatile guy. Our next speaker is Jason McDaniel, and he is an associate professor of political science at San Francisco State University. Professor McDaniel specializes in urban politics and voting behavior, and he has a particular emphasis on the influence of contextual effects on political behavior. So his current research projects include an exploration of racial contextual effects on voter turnout in San Francisco mayoral elections, an analysis of vote disqualifying ballot errors in San Francisco elections using instant runoff voting, and also an analysis of the ways that neighborhood context influences vote choice. So I'm looking forward to some very, very interesting presentations from both Steve and Jason. Steve, why don't you take it away?
Thank you very much. As Tony said, I'm Steve Chessin, president of Californians for Electoral Reform, and I've been working on this issue for an extremely long time. And since this talk is being hosted by the League of Women Voters of Santa Clara County Civil Discourse Committee, I'm going to set my talk in the context of the effort to convert Santa Clara County's current two-round runoff system for county offices to ranked choice voting. And I'm going to be sharing my slides. So let me set that up to share. I got to minimize this thing over here because it's blocking my view. Okay, great. And I want to thank the California Ranked Choice Voting Coalition for letting me use some of their slides. Right. Okay, so we're going to do a little pop quiz. Now, which is better for democracy? Having more voters decide elections or having fewer voters decide elections? I assume you'll agree with me that it is much better for democracy to have more people vote, have higher turnout. Yet here in Santa Clara County, we actually let primary voters decide the winner most of the time. Since 2000, 75% of county races, that's Board of Supervisors, Sheriff, Assessor, District Attorney, weren't on the November ballot because those races were decided in low turnout primaries. Just to make sure everyone's familiar with the current system, all the candidates for a given office are on the primary ballot, which is either in March in presidential years or in June in gubernatorial years, which adds to a little bit of confusion since the primary keeps shifting. And if someone gets a majority of the vote in that election, it's a single choice election, vote for one person. If someone gets a majority of the vote, they win. If no one gets a majority, then the top two vote getters are on the ballot in November. And of course, we only have two people. Whoever gets the most votes wins, and that's also a majority of the people who show up for the runoff. Now, only 37% of registered voters in Santa Clara County voted in the 2024 primary. Worse yet, those primary voters are not very representative of our population. White turnout in the primary is about 33% lower than in the general, but for Asian American, Blacks, and Latinos, turnout is 53% lower in the primary than in the general. Also, independents, younger voters, and renters are also underrepresented in the primary. Luckily, there's a solution, and it's within reach right now. We can get higher turnout, more representative general elections with majority winners by using ranked choice voting. And it's a simple upgrade to how we vote. Ranked choice voting allows you to rank your candidates, your choices, first, second, and third, and so on, instead of being forced to choose just one. And if your first choice can't win, your vote will automatically transfer to your second choice. I'm going to switch presentations. Oh, it's not switching. I'm going to have to stop the share and redo the share. So give me a second to do that. All right. One of the I'm going to show a video and it's not letting me optimize for a video clip. So the video that I show later will be a little bit jerky. I apologize for that. Anyway, ranked choice voting is not a new system, by the way. It was invented in the 1870s by an MIT professor who called it preferential voting. It was used in Queensland, Australia in 1893, and it went nationwide in Australia in 1919 and has continued to be used there to this day. And the Republic of Ireland has been using it since the 1920s, but it's relatively new here. Now, since different people learn differently, I'm going to explain ranked choice voting in three different ways. The first, I'm going to do it verbally, and then I'm going to show a video, and then we'll have a little exercise where we get to do it together. So in ranked choice voting, you rank your candidates in order of preference. Your first choice is who you really want to win. Your second choice is who you would want to win if your first choice can't win. Your third choice is who you'd want to win if your first two choices can't win, and so on and so forth down the ballot for as many or as few people you want to rank. The ballots get sorted by first choice. If someone has a majority, they win. But if no one has a majority, we eliminate the person who came in last, and we look at all the ballots again. Now, if your first choice is still in the running, your ballot stays with your first choice. But if your first choice was eliminated, your ballot will move to your second choice. And now we look at the ballots, and if someone has a majority of the ballots now, they win. Otherwise, we repeat this process. And since some people prefer to learn by seeing, I'm going to share a short video. This video was prepared by Minnesota Public Radio. Since ranked choice voting simulates a staggered series of runoff elections, it's sometimes called instant runoff voting, and that's the phrase that NPR uses. They also restrict in this example, in this video, to only ranking 3 candidates, but modern systems allow many more rankings. The equipment that the county has will allow people to rank up to 10 candidates if there are that many. So I'm going to start the video.
Vote for your favorite color.
The instant runoff way.
Instead of voting for just one color, you get to rank your top 3.
Well, purple is the best, but if I can't have purple, then I want blue. And if neither of those wins, then I guess I could live with yellow.
Now let's count up everybody's votes.
Under instant runoff rules, it's not enough just to get the most votes.
You need a majority.
More than 50% of the votes.
So, purple's ahead, but it only has 7 votes. It needs at least 11 to win.
So we eliminate whoever's in last place.
Sorry, yellow fans, we're going to your second choice.
2 more for pink.
1 for purple.
But no one has 11 votes yet.
Still no majority.
Bye-bye, blue. 3 for purple.
2 for pink.
And we have a winner.
The instant runoff way.
Okay. So now we're actually going to do a ranked choice voting election. We're going to walk through both sides of it, the voting process and the vote counting process. I'm going to paste a link in the chat, and I would like each of you to click on it. We're going to be voting for the mayor of Candytown. I'm going to click on that link as well, and then I'm going to share my screen. Okay, now I got to share my screen. All right. So we're going to elect the mayor of Candytown. There are 5 candidates: Milky Way, Snickers, Sour Patch Kids, Kit Kat, and Skittles. At least that's the order that they show up on my screen. When you click on the link, they might be in a different order, but that's okay. I need to shrink this slightly. There we go. I'm going to vote for Kit Kat first by clicking on Kit Kat in the first column. Maybe Milky Way second. Oops, no, Kit Kat first. Milky Way second. Now I'm going to change my vote. I want my second choice to be Snickers. And I'm going to make Milky Way third. And my fourth choice goes to Skittles. And then my 5th choice goes to Sour Patch Kids. So that's how easy it is to vote. And then I'm going to submit my ballot. I'm going to give everyone a few more seconds to submit their ballots, and then we'll walk through the results. And I also want to point out that we're not the only people voting in this election. Many others have voted and have already cast their ballots. So you're going to see a lot more ballots. Okay, so now if you click on the preliminary results, and I'll also paste a direct link to that in the chat. I guess I got to stop my share to get to the chat. Okay, there's a link to the results, which you can click on. And let me go back to sharing my screen. Okay, we're going to preliminary results. All right, now let's scroll that up so you can see how that goes. And let's stay with round 1. Okay. Now, as we can see, 188 people put Snickers as their first choice. 146 had Kit Kat as their first choice. 112 had Sour Patch Kids as their first choice. 89 had Milky Way as their first choice. 70 had Skittles as their first choice. There were a total of 605 votes. Takes 303 to get a majority. Well, no one has a majority, so we're going to eliminate whoever came in last. That's Skittles. So we're going to eliminate the votes that went to Skittles, and each person who voted for Skittles, each of those 70 people, will have their ballots moved to whoever they rank second. And so we see that 18 people rank Snickers second, 8 ranked Kit Kat second, 24 ranked Sour Patch Kids second, and 18 ranked Milky Way second. Now, still no one has a majority, although Snickers is still in the lead. So now we eliminate who is ever last. That's Milky Way. And we eliminate Milky Way, and now we transfer those votes. And Snickers picked up 48, Kit Kat picked up 49, Sour Patch Kids picked up 9. But still no one has a majority. So now we eliminate Sour Patch Kids. And it turns out, well, Snickers picked up 57 votes. Kit Kat picked up 81 votes. Snickers got got the majority with 311. Now, one might say Snickers got the most votes in the first round, so why bother with rankings? Well, sometimes the person who leads in the first round ends up losing to a candidate that gets more votes from supporters of other candidates as they're eliminated. And that actually happens in our current 2-round runoff system. For example, when Joe Simidian first ran for the Board of Supervisors, in the primary, he came in second. But it was between him and another candidate in the runoff, and he actually was able to win in the runoff by picking up the votes from people who had voted for other candidates who didn't make the runoff. So similarly, Snickers did not have a majority in the first round, and we didn't know who the majority winner was going to be until we went through the rankings and eliminated lower vote-getting candidates. Note that Snickers had to win by being the second or third or even the fourth choice of voters whose first choice was something else. I'm going to stop my share for now. The voting system also affects how people campaign. Here we were voting for inanimate objects, but in real elections, we vote for people, and the voting rules affect candidate behavior. We know that plurality elections and runoff elections, when there's only 2 people, encourage negative campaigning. If, say, Marianne and I are running for dog catcher, and if I throw mud at Marianne, saying that she kicks puppies and drowns kittens, that might not encourage you to vote for me, but it might discourage you from voting for Marianne, and you might sit out the election entirely, leave that portion of the ballot blank. And that helps me, because every voter I convince not to vote for Marianne helps me, even if they don't vote for me. But in a ranked choice voting election, in order to win, I might need to be the second choice of people who rank Marianne first. So I'm not going to throw mud at Marianne. I'm going to tell people where I agree with Marianne and where I disagree and keep it focused on the issues. And this isn't just a hypothetical. I want to show you a video that was prepared by the 3 leading candidates out of a field of 8 in a 2018 Oakland City Council election. So I'm going to share my screen again. And oops, before I share my screen, I got to make sure I got the video up. There we go. Now I got to share my screen. Good. Okay. This is about a minute long, and it might be a little jerky because it's not optimized for a video clip, but it will be sharing the sound.
Hi, I'm Pam Harris.
I'm Nayeli Maxon.
I'm Shane Tao.
We're running for Oakland City Council District 4.
For the past 16 years, this seat has been held by dynamic women.
We are 3 well-qualified candidates for City Council.
We are mothers, public servants, and community leaders.
Pam has 20 years of nonprofit finance experience. She can manage any budget.
Nayeli has worked in the District 4 office. She knows the district's issues inside and out.
Shane has worked for the City Council for 5 years. She has the experience to get results.
We're asking for your support on November 6th.
This is a ranked choice election. Vote for us 1, 2, or 3.
You can learn more about us on our websites.
Vote for positive leadership,
Collaborative leadership,
Women's leadership.
Okay. Now, when was the last time you saw competing candidates extol the virtues of their opponents? Only one of those 3 people could win, yet they each praised one of the others. And it worked, as one of them did win, and it was because supporters of the others ranked the ultimate winner as their second or third choice. Now I'm going to share another slide. Okay, it's clear why ranked choice voting is getting more and more popular. San Francisco, Oakland, and several other cities in California have been using it. And New York City and 2 states, Maine and Alaska, now let voters rank the candidates, with more than 13 million people having voted in ranked choice elections around the United States. And we did a poll of likely voters in Santa Clara County to see what they felt about ranked choice voting. The poll was done in December 2023, and 64% of the voters wanted to see Santa Clara County switch to using ranked choice voting. And many of our elected officials and a diverse array of community groups, including the League of Women Voters of Santa Clara County, support ranked choice voting because they know it will improve representation and make for better, fair elections. And that's the end of my talk. So I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to reserve the balance of my time for later so that we have more time for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve. I really appreciate that. And next up, Jason, if you'd like to take the podium, please.
Absolutely, and thank you for inviting me to participate. I always love talking to League of Women Voters groups and audiences, so thank you. Glad to be here. So here's the title of my slide, and I think really encapsulates my research and my read of the political science research on ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting enhances choice. There's no doubt about it. That also comes with an increased complexity, and there's few benefits from it. So my experience with ranked choice voting started about 15 years ago when I moved to San Francisco to take a position at San Francisco State University. I had never heard of ranked choice voting. In fact, at the time, it wasn't really called ranked choice voting. It was sort of called instant runoff voting. That term comes from, RCV comes kind of from San Francisco's Department of Elections, sort of trying to make that a more accurate term for what's going on here. And I immediately thought to myself that this seems more complicated than choosing one candidate, right? And I'd studied voting for a long time at that point. I've studied it even longer at this point. And what my field tells me, what my understanding of political science research tells me is that when you make voting more complicated, or when you increase barriers to voting, it's going to have negative effects, at least some negative effects. Maybe not always, maybe not all the time, but when you make voting more complicated, you're going to have some negative effects. And so I was very curious about this, and so I started studying it. Today, I'm going to present some of my own research. And I'm also going to present some research from others about ranked choice voting. It's become a very popular topic of study. And I want to start, though, and I want to piggyback a little bit off of what Steve was saying. What is ranked choice voting? And I used to have to explain this to a lot of people. I still do, but people have become more familiar with it. And I boiled down, it's these two things, right? Which is the institution of allowing ranked ballots. So instead of just having one choice, you are allowed to, and in some cases required to, rank multiple candidate options, right? Rank order them from preference from first to second to third, and so on. Plus the instant runoff vote allocation tally process, right? That allocates votes according to the rank preferences, eliminates candidates, just as Steve was describing. What this tends to do in the United States, at least, is eliminate the primary or eliminate one, sort of two-round process. I do want to correct Steve slightly. What Santa Clara has currently is not a two-round runoff system. Technically, it is a process whereby candidates are running during a state primary. Most counties and cities have their elections coincide with the primary elections, and that winnows the field down to two candidates usually, right? And then there's a November general, right? A runoff technically is when there's a November general election only, and then if nobody gets a majority, then a separate runoff election. San Francisco used to have that kind of process where maybe in December or January, a month after the election, there might be a runoff. This matters because the claims for ranked choice voting increasing participation come merely from the idea of comparing state primaries to November generals. And you'll note that the institution of ranked choice voting in Santa Clara does not, they're still voting in November, right? So that idea of increased turnout and participation, it comes from when elections are held. And we know in political science quite clearly that when elections are held in November or when they coincide with state and federal elections, you tend to get higher turnout than if they don't, right? Especially for county, city elections, right? So ranked choice voting in and of itself, just from shifting when perhaps the voting is happening or some of the voting is happening does not increase turnout by itself. So I want to go through some claims about ranked choice voting and then evaluate those with, as much as I can with the research. So here's some of the claims. So number one, and a claim that I first encountered when I started studying this, is that the expanded choice will increase participation. Not just that they'll eliminate the spring primary, right, an April or May or June primary, but rather the idea that more candidates can run, more candidates do run, that voters have the ability to rank them. What that will do is that they don't have to vote for a lesser of two evils. They don't have to hold their nose and say, well, I'm going to vote for this candidate because they have a chance to win, but my preferred candidate, perhaps somebody who is more ideologically consistent with where I am, that I won't vote for them because they don't have a chance to win. In theory, what ranked choice voting does is eliminate that kind of process of thinking, right? That allows people to rank their preferences without fear of wasting their vote, right? And so that the theory then is this will make people more likely to turn out to vote because they'll be able to vote for candidates who they truly like and truly feel represent their interest. That is the only theory by which ranked choice voting itself can increase participation, right? So I'm gonna examine that claim. Other claims that I see for ranked choice voting, for the benefits of ranked choice voting, that it will enhance campaign civility, reduce negative campaigning. I'm going to speak to some of that. There's some research that tends to support that idea. There's another claim that it will reduce political polarization. It'll allow people to not have to be sort of trapped by the candidates that might be ideologically extreme because of primary elections, right? And so that more moderate candidates, that have more majority support might be able to win. I had some research that speaks to that claim. Spoiler alert, it doesn't seem to pan out. The others with the idea that it will elect candidates who represent a true majority. I'm going to speak to that claim as well with some research relying upon colleagues and friends of mine who've done research on that. And finally, it's not mentioned, but I used to see this quite often, that it would help counties and cities save money on election administration. This is something that a lot of cities care a lot about. And so it was a claim that's been evaluated by political scientists and others. And I think the idea is that by eliminating a state primary, it eliminates the amount of money that they might have to spend on elections. I think that's the main theory of that. There's other ideas and benefits for ranked choice voting, but these are some of the main ones that I think advocates tend to make claims for. As I said, though, political science research provides very little evidence, if any, to support these claims, some more than others. My own research in particular starts from this perspective, and I think it is undisputed in my field. Ranked choice voting, the act of ranking multiple options, is inherently more complex than just choosing one. We know we have research in political psychology and consumer marketing, people going to grocery stores and looking at, choosing one product versus ranking multiple products. There's a ton of research that shows that people find ranking to be a more difficult and complex process. I think there's very little dispute around that idea. My theory is that will lead to create some barriers to participation. And so I'm going to go through some of my own research and my findings. So first I asked, in what ways does ranked choice voting affect voter participation? Does it increase voter turnout or does it not? My findings, and I'll try to interpret this. This is a graph it's become more and more complex. So I'll try to, make it simpler for people. In a paper that I've written recently called The Cost of Complexity, I examined voter turnout in mayoral elections in cities that use ranked choice voting compared to about 200 cities that don't use ranked choice voting. And what I find here, in each of these little different colored dots, is a different way of estimating the impact, right? It's a different measure. And what I find here is that voter turnout declines immediately in the first election after the implementation of ranked choice voting, from about 2 to 4 percentage points, maybe 5 by some measures, right? That diminishes in the next election and probably goes away in the third election, right? So a decrease in voter turnout, significant, by the way, anything about 2 to 4 percentage points is quite a significant reduction in voter turnout, even though that negative effect tends to diminish over time. In another article I published several years ago, I found that not only does it decrease turnout, but it tends to exacerbate some of the inequalities that we see related to age and education. Ranked choice voting seems to be particularly attractive to people who have high levels of education, college education, graduate degree especially, and they tend to be more excited to use it and more likely to use it and use it well. But that's not everybody in a city election or a county election or a state election. And so inequalities along education lines seem to be exacerbated by ranked choice voting. I also examined participation in terms of ballot errors. Ranked choice voting has a process whereby if you make a mistake on your ballot in the ranking process, that is called an overvote error, and your ballot is disqualified. There is no way to determine what your intentions were if you make an overvote ballot error. And my colleague and I studied this in San Francisco and some other places. And in-person voting, there are machines that would tell you if you made an error and you could do a new ballot. But what we found, of course, is that people who voted absentee or vote by mail at that time did not have access to that, right? And so what we found was that ballot errors were much more likely in lower income and lower education areas. That's a study that was just a few years ago in New York City. I found with my colleague, Francis Neely, that in areas of San Francisco that were more where more racial minority groups lived, higher rates of ballot errors, and it was more prevalent on those vote by mail and absentee balloting. Now, of course, we got a huge increase in vote by mail since the pandemic era, and so I am particularly concerned about this. My research, to put a fine point on it, shows that you should expect some negative consequences from the implementation of ranked choice voting. There's no doubt about that in my mind. Now, those negative consequences might not matter to some people. They might feel like the trade-off is worth it. Maybe some of those negative consequences will diminish over time. I happen to disagree with that, but nonetheless, I think we should not be only thinking that it will be a positive, absolutely positive. There will be some negative consequences. Hold on, sorry. I also looked, and I'll try to do this one briefly, at this argument that it reduces polarization. In city elections, we don't have party labels in California city elections, right? And so what we looked at was polarization along racial lines. Were white people and black people more likely to vote for similar candidates, or Latino people or Asian people? Was there less polarization, less racial block voting, so to speak? Right? Did it encourage more of that kind of cooperative coalition type voting? The answer is no. In fact, there was no effect on polarization. My research in 2018 has been replicated and confirmed by some really brilliant young professors a couple of years ago. And again, that there's just no effect. And so a lot of people hoping for that kind of moderation or reduction of polarization, I think they're putting their hopes in changing to ranked choice voting, and I think they're probably going to be disappointed. Ranked choice voting does not reduce polarization so far as we can tell so far, right? This is a graph from their paper, the Assoc and Landsman paper, and it just shows that all of the different ways they looked at it, the different kinds of racially polarized voting, there's no effect. All those dots and lines cross the zero effect line there. So I thought that was a nice little simple graph that I would show there. So no effect on that. However, we also know that ranked choice voting does have an effect on racial, ethnic, minority group voting. And it has several effects. One, study after study finds that people of color are less likely to take advantage of the full options to rank multiple candidates. Now, I don't necessarily know why that is. I have some suspicions about that, but for a variety of reasons, every study that I've seen on this so far finds that the people of color are less likely to use ranked choice voting. Again, I think ranked choice voting is more attractive to the more educated, the more white portions of the electorate. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think we should be clear about this idea here. We also find that voters do rely upon the race and gender of the candidates more in ranked choice voting elections than they do in non-ranked choice voting elections. So it seems to make race and gender more prevalent, more important to the voting process. Now, that might explain this last finding. It's one of the papers that I found that does have a positive effect for ranked choice voting. There is some evidence that, at least in some recent years, that after the implementation of ranked choice voting, minority women candidates did better. Now, I don't think that paper is perfect, but it's pretty good. And so I think that's a clear result. I'm not sure it'll be replicated. I'm trying to replicate it, having difficulties on that. But nonetheless, I want to make sure I say some positive things when the research supports that idea. Again, I'm probably talking too fast, but let me go forward to this. There's a lot of studies of this basic question. How well do voters understand ranked choice voting? And the research is mixed, but generally, the top line finding, and these are professors who are just really good, and they've done a lot of work on ranked choice voting. Most voters, when you ask them, they report high levels of understanding and satisfaction with ranked choice voting. There's no doubt about that. Poll after poll, study after study, wherever ranked choice voting is used, people say, I like it, I understand it. Now, I will say, as a political scientist, when you ask people about that, that is what we call a selection effect. That people, of course, are less likely to want to say that they don't understand something after using it. Other studies get deeper into it and find more mixed results. Particularly, the consistent finding in studies that look at this, older voters tend to report less understanding of the voting process in ranked choice voting cities compared to those that are not, right? And older voters express more difficulty in ranking candidates, right? Than younger voters. I think this is an issue, especially since older voters are much more likely to turn out. Finding that difficulty, none of this is to say that difficulty, older voters can learn, and just like younger voters, I think younger voters have a problem with this as well. I just don't think the studies have been able to show anything about that. I have a problem with it sometimes myself. It's not easy, right? But I just want to highlight that. There's also similar studies that find that those who are less interested in politics, and by that we mean those who are just occasional voters, they're not the kind of people who come to a League of Women Voters meeting. They find it more difficult. More conservative voters who are often less attached to the electoral process for a variety of reasons also tend to finding it more difficult. And generally, there's a reduction in people who report that it's easy to understand the voting process, right? Now, the good news is I say not much evidence, there's almost no evidence that there's a bias along racial ethnic lines in levels of understanding. So that I think is a good non-binding, I mean, no evidence of bias there. I think that's really good. But nonetheless, I think the predominance of this research finds that although people report high levels of understanding, there's also a lot of nuance and reasons to expect people to have difficulties and express difficulties and experience difficulties with understanding the process. I get that all the time. Reporters, everybody still in San Francisco expresses difficulty with this. Now, that's not a reason to say we shouldn't do ranked choice voting, but I think it's an important thing to consider. The one piece of evidence for the benefit of ranked choice voting is the idea of campaign civility. The research is pretty clear on this. Ranked choice voting processes, campaigns, increase the perception of civil positive campaigning, right? Again, Donovan and Tolbert recently published a review of work on this, and their conclusion was yes, absolutely, but there are limits to this. It doesn't eliminate negative campaigning. It doesn't cause people to feel like negative campaigning is gone, right? It just increases the perception. So voters in ranked choice voting cities viewed campaigns as less negative, but ranked choice voting in the campaign was only a small part of their perceptions of negative campaigning, right? So state, federal, these sorts of things, campaign commercials, it was real, but it was limited, right? The effects here. Campaigns themselves report increased incentives to campaign in a positive way, to campaign in a less negative way. I think that's a pretty good result. They tend to do that, to reach out to voters, to do more of that kind of positive cooperative campaigning. Interestingly, though, the frontrunner candidates report not experiencing this. And I think this is interesting to me. The frontrunner candidates are those that usually win. And I think what we see is that there's more cooperation amongst candidates who have less of a chance of winning, right? And then they're more likely to attack the frontrunner, right? And so I think there are limits to this idea of campaign civility, but I think it's real. At the end of the day, voters repeatedly express satisfaction with campaign conduct, right? I think there's some diminishing effects there, but it's real. So this is the one clear positive benefit, at least the perception of this, voters have of ranked choice voting. Now, I want to speak to this idea of a true majority. This is a little bit complicated, and I hope that you'll forgive me for this. People sometimes argue that because of lower turnout, primary elections, or elections in November, that maybe higher turnouts, that the majority, the true majority, is not having a say because maybe people preferred the runoff candidate, the candidates who were eliminated in the primary, and so maybe their votes are not really mattering in the general election. Is the way this is often put, right? The studies of this make this a little bit more complicated. The key is that the winning candidate in an RCV election gets a majority of what we call continuing ballots. A study by Burnett and Kogan that looks at this found that the winner's actual vote share was usually around 43, 44, 45% of registered voters, right? So it's not a true majority. Why is this? It's because of what we call exhausted ballots or inactive ballots. If you do not, and this is something that was not a part of Steve's presentation or the video that Steve showed, didn't point out that if you don't fully rank all the candidates, or if you don't rank one of the final two candidates, your ballot may be exhausted. It may be thrown out. It will be thrown out if you don't rank, all the candidates. As your favorite candidates are eliminated, your ballot, if it doesn't have any more of the candidates who are still in the race, your ballot will not be counted. It will not be included, I should say, in the majority calculation, right? So this idea of exhausted or inactive ballots is a very big deal. In Bay Area cities, the study showed, and I'm being conservative here, about 10% of voters, ballots were exhausted. In many elections, that is more than the margin of victory. In 2018, it was much lower than the margin of victory in San Francisco. There was one election in San Francisco where 23% of ballots were exhausted, meaning they did not include one of the final two candidates that had a majority to calculate that majority. That is a huge number of voters, right? And what we find is that the number of exhausted ballots increases with more candidates, which is one of the things that ranked choice voting tries to do, is bring more candidates into the process. We find that a substantial share of voters fail to rank all candidates. Many candidates encourage their voters not to do so. We see that here in San Francisco right now. The current mayor, London Breed, has done that in the past, saying like, just vote for me. Don't worry about other candidates, right? It's called bullet voting sometimes. So this is an issue. It's a complicated issue. I'm not saying it's a reason to necessarily not use ranked choice voting, but it does add to the argument that it's more complex, and it's more complex to understand what's actually going on. And I think sometimes it might contribute to a sort of sense of well, there are some who talk about the ranked choice voting process creating a sense of illegitimacy because you can sort of win with only 35% or so of first choice votes. It's a pretty common thing. Now, I don't think that's a fair criticism, but people often feel this way. And so the complexity of ranked choice voting does cause, I think, people to be more likely to doubt the outcome of the elections. Now, I should be careful. I don't want to over exaggerate that point. It's not something I've been able to prove. It's just in talking to people that I get that sense sometimes, especially if their preferred candidate doesn't win, right? But again, this idea of exhausted ballots does not receive enough attention. You combine that with voter errors, and it's often the case that the margin of victory would have been different if there was not as many exhausted ballots and not as many disqualified ballots due to voter errors. One final little point that I think is interesting. A young grad student, he's no longer a young grad student, he used to be, looked at the cost question. Does ranked choice voting reduce election cost? The evidence is basically no, but it probably doesn't increase it. But what we find is that those cities that adopt ranked choice voting spend more money on elections administration already. I think that's because it's the kind of places like in the Bay Area where people care a lot about elections. People like, places like Santa Clara County, places like San Francisco. And so, I think that is not because of ranked choice voting. I think it's because of just the way we are in these places. It does increase the cost of election administration in the implementation phase, although that tends to come down. So it looks like there's not much effect at all. It doesn't save money, but probably doesn't necessarily cost more money either, right? Probably a no effect thing there. I think it's important to talk to city clerks, county election administrators to get their perspective. on the implementation difficulties and the cost. I have seen in some jurisdictions in the United States where elections are, let's say, distrusted, and where they will use the idea of high cost to try to eliminate, some elections and try to reduce the cost of election administration. Look, let me be clear: the Republican Party has a lot of it is because of Donald Trump is declaring war on election administrators in a lot of places, and a lot of places have also defunded election administrators because of that, right? I think that this is something that we should care about, right? So that's not something I think we have to worry too much about here in the Bay Area, in California, but it is something I think that is important to think about, right? And so just putting it all together, just wrapping it up, ranked choice voting, it definitely enhances the amount of choice, the kind of choice you can express with your ballot, but it is a more complex process, and that complexity will lead to negative consequences, such as reduced turnout and more ballot errors. Voter education and voter information can diminish these negative effects, but they're no panacea. Anybody who's worked with election administrators should know it is hard to get to voters. It's hard to reach out to voters. People like us, we hear that, right? We pay attention to the voter information guides and these sorts of things. We watch the videos that help us understand how to do the ranked choice voting, but most people don't, or many. And so I'm a little bit uncertain or doubtful about the ability of city and county governments and state governments to really ameliorate these negative effects. It's unlikely to reduce polarization. And I think a lot of the other proposed benefits of ranked choice voting are exaggerated at best. And there's some complicated things there. They're basically summarizing some things I've already said. But I think I'll end there. And if other people have any questions, I'm happy to entertain those and try my best to answer those. Thank you very much, John.
Well, Jason, thank you very much for a very enlightening presentation. Really appreciate that. We have lots of questions, and I'm going to pass on to Clara.
Myself, and go to some of these questions that have come up that are interesting and somewhat complicated. So first question to Professor McDaniel. You talked about racial polarization as a proxy for political polarization. How are those two types of polarization related or correlated?
It's a great question. That's a really great question. You're hitting my political science brain there. It's hard to say, but I'll give you some arguments for why they're similar and why they're different. In political science, we see pretty clearly that partisanship is more of an identity than it is about policy, right? It's something where we're like, let me think about the policies that the candidates are doing and then choose my party. We choose our party, and that's a long-term process of, when we were young and as we're growing older, and it's not unrelated to policy, but it's really an identity. It's really a sense of who we are as a politically engaged person. And racial identity there's some similarities there. These are deep-seated things that are not the same, but they're related. And so I do think it's fair to think about this, at least my paper, in terms of a proxy. But where they're different is the key idea of partisan polarization, which is that sense that we just either like people that are like us in our party and similar to us, and we dislike the others that are maybe from the other party. And that is the kind of thing that party labels on the ballot are not going to go away on state elections and federal elections, most likely. And so I think the idea of will ranked choice voting reduce partisan polarization in state and federal type elections, which some jurisdictions have adopted, I think no, right? I think no. But at the same time, party labels can help us make choices a little bit better. So I actually think ranked choice voting processes work better when you have clear party labels. And we see this in the European context, the international context, Ireland, Australia. So it's a complicated question. I don't know if I answered it, but there you go. There you go.
Steve, would you like to comment on that same question?
Which question was that one?
I'm sorry. It's
racial polarization is a proxy for political polarization?
As a proxy for political polarization.
No, I don't have comment to that, but I would like to respond to some of the other points that Professor McDaniel made, if I may.
I think we should give you a chance, of course.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Because he said many things.
I did.
And I may share some slides as well. In terms of ballot errors, it is true that people from lower income, lower education communities, racial minority communities do make more errors on ranked choice voting ballots, but they also make more errors on non-ranked choice voting ballots, and those error rates are comparable. The county will not save money by going to ranked choice voting because the county still has to conduct a statewide primary. But if the city of San Jose were to go to ranked choice voting, it would eliminate them having to pay the county for running a primary election. And we figure the cost savings would be about annualized about $125,000 a year. I talked to some San Jose City Council members about that because that seems like a drop in the budget compared to San Jose's overall budget. But they say, no, that could really help in terms of like getting a new park done or something like that. So it's not nothing to sneeze at. And if I can share some slides, in terms of cost for Santa Clara County, it would cost, the county's estimated would cost about $1.7 million per general election. That's every 2 years. That is about 0.015% of the annual county budget, or $1.66 per registered voter. So it's a very small cost for the county to actually implement ranked choice voting. It looks like a large number absolute, that number, but when you look at the, in terms of relative, it's very small. Let's see what else. Oh, that is confusing for voters. Actually, what I want to share is not this. I want to share some exit polls. I'm going to share a link. There we go. I'm going to put this link in the chat because there's a lot of data here. And I want people to click on that link and take a look at it, you know, in their free time. But basically, this is a compilation of exit polls from all the places that have been using ranked choice voting. And you can see the large majority of voters found it simple, want to keep using it, say they understand it, and preferred it over the prior method. And if you go to that page, these are actually clickable links to more details on those exit polls. Let's see what else that I would like to share. I talked about ballot errors. Again, it was, yeah, this one's very interesting. Yeah. Voters of color tend to use more rankings than white voters, is what we've discovered in terms of ranked choice voting, the studies that Fair Vote has done. And it also increases youth voter turnout. And it's helping people of color make electoral history. New York City, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Salt Lake City all elected their most diverse city councils ever using ranked choice voting. So is there anything else that I want to share from?
I would point out that only one of those things I think comes from a peer-reviewed study. Fair Vote, you know, they put out, they're the organization that's been advocating for ranked choice voting for decades now, and there's some good people that are involved with them, but you know, they tend to put emphasize only look, they're an advocacy group. They emphasize the positive things there, right? And so I would just point that out.
Okay, and I want to point out, because what was raised in the chat about recalls, and I want to say that any election system can elect somebody that the voters later regret electing. In the United States, Randy Duke Cunningham elected in our partisan primary, in the old partisan primary and then general election system. He had pled guilty to tax evasion, conspiracy to commit bribery, mail fraud, and wire fraud in federal court. Senator Bob Mendez was indicted for taking bribes, working for foreign governments, and actually he's now resigned from Congress. Representative Henry Cuellar, also indicted for money laundering, conspiracy, and bribery. And in Santa Clara County, under the existing, well, okay, I use the phrase two-round runoff because there's one round, and if no one gets a majority in the first round, there's a runoff. Some people like to call that a contingent runoff, but it's the current system that we use. Anyway, Santa Clara County Supervisor George Shirkow Jr. was elected to the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors in 2008 under that two-round runoff or contingent runoff system, and reelected in 2012. And then he had to resign in 2013 after being charged with perjury, felony misuse of public funds, and associated misdemeanors. San Jose City Council member Terry Gregory. San Jose uses that same, what I call two-round runoff system that the county uses. He was elected in 2002. And he resigned in 2005 before his term ended after pleading no contest to charges of failing to report gifts and of accepting gifts in return for attempting to influence decisions of the city council. And in my own hometown of Mountain View, where we elect the city council using plurality at large system, Mountain View City Council member Mario Ambra, who's elected in 1996, reelected in 2000, removed from office in 2002 after being found guilty of misconduct. So any voting system can elect somebody that the voters generally later reject electing. And people,
can I speak to that too? I agree with that for the most part. I will say, and there's two situations that I would point to on that. And then there's some really good questions, and in the chat, I want to get to them as well. I think that's important to get some of those. You know, here in San Francisco, famously, we had a DA, Chessin, who was elected. He was elected through a ranked choice voting process. He was the first place vote getter, so it was not like he needed to get, he might have won without ranked choice voting, right, as well. But I do think that the requirement, the not having to make a candidate run and get a majority, right? So like in a general or a runoff election, that might contribute to some people then when there is a recall or a recall process to having less attachment to that candidate, right? And so therefore that, again, only 36% of people put him first choice on their ballot, around 36%. More people had him on their ballot, so it's complicated. And I haven't studied it yet. I haven't seen any studies about this yet. I don't think that would be a ranked choice voting problem, as you say, but it's possible. What I will say is this, though. In 2018, London Breed won the San Francisco election, and it was really close after a ranked choice voting tally, right? In the first run of votes, she led in first place votes by over 10%, right? And yet, in the early voting or the early rounds of collecting the ballots, mail ballots were coming in, when they did the ranked choice voting process, she was behind after that first tally. And a lot of African American voters in San Francisco were shocked by that. And there was, if she ended up losing that election, I have been told reliably, there would have been a movement to try to get rid of ranked choice voting in San Francisco. Now, that didn't happen, and I'm not trying to scaremonger, but I think it's something that ranked choice voting advocates need to think about, right? That if people feel like, wait a second, my person got the most first choice votes, why are they not the winner, right? It doesn't happen that often, right? 11% of the time, maybe there's some studies on how often the first choice vote getter does not win. And it varies from about 6 to 11% of the time. So maybe that's not a major problem, but it's something I think people should think about. And if I could, there's some really good questions. I'm trying to get to them, if you don't mind. Sharon, I know you were moderating the questions there. Gosh, there's one that I wanted to.
I'm happy to have each of you take turns picking the ones that you'd like to respond to.
So I'm going to ask, I think Tom Charon asked about the exhausted ballot issue and compared it to the drop in turnout and runoff elections. This is something that I wish, you know, I used to talk to the director of Fair Vote quite a bit. We don't talk anymore, but they put forward a myth that runoff elections are always low turnout. That's not true. And in San Francisco alone, runoff elections before the adoption of ranked choice voting, and half of the ones I looked at, turnout was higher in the runoff than it was in the general election. And that was a separate runoff election, right? The election in November, if there's a primary, the primary will be low turnout, right? The November general will not be usually, right? And so the idea of exhausted ballots being equivalent to lower turnout in a primary or runoff, I think is a false equivalence. But what I would say is that it's inherent to the process, right? And so I actually think having a primary maybe and then more turnout in a general, which is what I think there is right now in Santa Clara, that allows voters who don't normally vote in primary elections to at least be faced with just two candidates, and that's an easier choice for them. So again, that's my preference on that thing. I don't think ranked choice voting is the worst thing in the world, but it is more complex, right, is what I would say. And I think the exhausted ballot issue is over and above the issue of whether turnout is lower in one runoff or one primary compared to a general. And then I'll let other questions happen there.
Professor McDaniel, we also have a request from one of the participants. if you could enter into the chat or email a link to the cost
Yeah.
of complexity paper that you referenced, that would
I
be
will try to
appreciated.
do that. I'm terrible at having things on the web, and it's under review at a journal right now. So it's like I get a little bit, but I do have a version. I think it's publicly accessible on a website, and I'll do my best to find that before we're done. but if I'm not able to do that, just please email me, and I'm happy to email you a copy. My email there is in the chat again. Happy to email you the latest copy of that. A peer review process is always fun, so I don't want to get. Sometimes I'm scared about getting things out there before the peer reviewers have a chance to look at it. But yes. Anyway, so go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for Steve about, there's a whole bunch of questions about ranked choice voting. After their elections, when all is said and done, where can voters go to see which candidates got what numbers of votes?
Unmute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, that has to do with the best practice for displaying results. And I want to, it's best done with a spreadsheet. If you give me a moment, I can find on my computer where I have such a spreadsheet. But it's going to take me a few minutes to click through to get to the election that I want to show you people, which had to do with the Oakland mayor's election. And I think this is it. Yes. Okay. Let me share my screen. Now I showed this, with the Candy Town election, but this is another way of showing the results. Let me make this a little bit. Why is this thing? There we go. I'm gonna make this a little bit bigger. There we go. Okay, this is from the 2010 election, and it shows in the first round the number of votes each candidate got. There were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10 candidates. And then it expresses that as a percent. And then when they eliminate, so that's round one, these first two columns. And then at the end of round one, they eliminated the 268 write-in votes, and they transferred those. 149 people who wrote in a candidate, maybe they just wrote in Mickey Mouse. They didn't really care who got elected mayor, so they didn't bother ranking anybody else. So that goes into the exhausted ballot pile. We have 2,306 people who skipped this race entirely. They didn't vote for anybody, so those are undervoted. Then there were some people who overvoted. You can overvote in a single choice election. You can overvote in a ranked choice voting election. There were 355 of those ballots. So then when the 268 were eliminated, they got transferred, which leads to the round two totals. And then at the end of round two, they're going to eliminate Arnold Fields, who came in last, and those votes get transferred, and we keep going through the rounds. Now you'll notice in round one, Don Parada was leading with almost 34% of the vote. Jean Quan was second with slightly less than 25% of the vote. Rebecca Kaplan had about 22% of the vote. And Parada kept that lead pretty much all the way until the very end. When Rebecca Kaplan was finally eliminated, more of her voters selected Jean Quan as their next choice than Don Parada, and that put Jean Quan over the finish line, 51% to 49%. And that can happen. That happened with Joe Simidian, in a 2-round runoff election. That can happen. Usually it's the person who comes in first in the first round ends up winning, but not always. And that's why we recommend as best practice that the registrar should run a preliminary ranked choice tally with whatever ballots they have, so the voters know how close or how not close the election is on election night. Because if all you report, as the Alameda County Registrar did in 2010, all he reported on election night was these results, which the newspapers the next morning said, oh, Don Parada has an insurmountable 9-point lead. Well, he finally ran the tally on Friday, which showing that 9-point insurmountable lead, turning into a 1-point or 2-point deficit. And that meant what happened? Well, if you run that preliminary tally on election night, then you're not going to get that kind of what happened. Now, I want to point out, because Professor McDaniel talked about if that London Breed election had been reversed, people would have wanted to repeal ranked choice voting. Well, actually, that's what happened in Oakland. There was a movement to, after Jean Quan made some errors, and again, like I said, any system can elect somebody that the people later regret. She made some political mistakes about 6 months after she was sworn into office, and the people who were supporting Don Parada blamed his loss on ranked choice voting and tried to get a repeal effort going. They were not successful in getting a repeal measure on the ballot. But I want to compare when Kamala Harris first ran for Attorney General of California. I believe that was in 2018. And in the runoff, in the November runoff election, because we had gone to a top 2 system by then, where the top 2 candidates, even if one gets a majority in the primary, the top 2 go to a runoff in November. Her Republican opponent was Steve Cooley. And it was so close on election night that the press did not call the election. And as they tallied more votes, the absentee ballots that came in on election day, the vote by mails that came in within, was it 5 or 7 days after election day, as more and more votes got tallied, the lead kept switching back and forth over a three-week period between Steve Cooley and Kamala Harris. Steve Cooley finally conceded the race 3 weeks after election day, saying, there's no way I'm going to win. But Kamala Harris did not declare victory for another week when even more ballots, because then they have to go into the provisionals, even more ballots had been processed, and it showed that she was clearly going to be the winner. So you get close elections in ranked choice voting, you get close elections in single choice voting, you get landslides in single choice elections, and you get landslides in ranked choice voting. You really don't know on election night, unless they do one of these preliminary tallies, you don't know just by first choices if an election is close or not. So I hope I've addressed that issue.
Let me ask another one to Jason. Could Professor McDaniel talk more about how the difference between self-reporting understanding in election exit polls, most say they understand it, versus actually looking at the ballots and seeing if there are errors? Why do exit polls show everyone understanding RCV?
I think it is two things. One, I think when you ask some, people are very reluctant to say they don't understand something, especially if they just don't. People just, there's a human nature, thing there to just not want to admit that, there was difficulties there. That doesn't mean they were lying. I'm not saying that. And I think people can understand it, right? But you combine that with the fact that these surveys are surveys of people who are already using it and who probably were part of the electorate that approved the use of it in a place like San Francisco or San Leandro or in Minneapolis. These are the people who, what I've been saying, which is are more likely to be the more high education, high propensity voters that we would expect to like and understand ranked choice voting. The ones I'm concerned about then are those that would probably not be captured in an exit poll survey or a self-reported survey, because they're the ones who might be turned off by the system and they didn't have a chance to weigh in on in the first place, right? So the studies that really get into the complexity of it, what we do know is that, I have, there's political psychology studies that show that it is a more cognitively demanding task for the brain to rank than it is to choose. Now, I think that tends to turn some people off. But nonetheless, I think, I'm not saying people don't express some understanding. I just think that that's not necessarily the best way to judge whether a system is working in all the ways that I would like it to work in terms of how we judge voter participation, ballot errors, disqualified ballots. I think these things are important as well. And these are the kinds of people that would be less likely to be sampled, participate in a self-reported exit poll survey. Now, again, I'm not saying these results are wrong. I just think that there's limitations to the conclusions we can draw from those kinds of data.
Okay, I have a question for Steve. Is there any study that looks at voting rates for down ballot candidates who are elected by ranked choice voting when there is a full ballot with many candidates and propositions, such as what we will have this November, as opposed to voting rates during primaries?
Well, first of all, I'm not a researcher.
Yeah.
I have not studied all of the literature. That's more Professor McDaniel's area of expertise.
Yeah.
I will say that there is voter drop-off from top of the ticket going down. That happens in the primary election that we have today, and it'll also happen in a November general election. So voter drop-off does happen. I did want to
ballot, I could expand on ballot roll off, right? It will happen. It does happen, and it's not necessarily about ranked choice voting. I don't think at all. It is more about the candidates, and when voters are engaged in an election because they feel like it's important, or there's candidates that appeal to them in terms of well-known candidates like in a mayoral election or what have you, then I think you see less roll off. What I would say though, I would sort of flip that around to say, yeah, like ranked choice voting probably does not increase that sort of thing, but we don't know. I will say I haven't seen, there haven't been studies on that. And I am particularly concerned about it, even beyond ranked choice voting, as more and more cities consolidate elections with presidential years. What we're going to see is we got presidential elections, we got Senate, we got Congress, we got state, we got local, we got ballot initiatives, we got county. Our ballots are going to get longer and longer. I do expect more roll off for local elections, regardless of ranked choice voting. And what I mean, so what I take away from that is that ranked choice voting, again, it's not the worst thing in the world, but I don't think it changes much either. And so that's where I would put that on that.
Well, I would like to say that people are more likely to vote in an election if they see a candidate that they like in that election. Now, for example, in the primary for Congressional District 16, I think there were like 8 or 10 candidates in the primary. And if your favorite candidate didn't make the runoff, you might be inclined to skip that portion of the ballot in the November election. But if all of those candidates are actually on the November ballot, not that we're going to use ranked choice voting for Congress, but let's suppose we did, with all those candidates on the ballot in November, your favorites there, the voter is going to be engaged because I'm going to be able to vote for the person I really like. And if that person I really like can't win, well, I get to put down who my second choice is, who my third choice is, and so on and so forth. So people are more likely to vote when they see somebody, when they get engaged, as Professor McDaniel said. As far in terms of the cognitive burden, I disagree with that, because when there's a large field, the voters are going to go through the candidates, they're going to read the literature, many voters, and they're going to do this sorting in their heads. They say, well, there's 8 candidates. These 3 people are really, you're trying to cut me off on time. These 3 people really like it. I really like these 3 people. These people are in the middle, and these 3 people I don't like at all. And I'm going to devote my time to those 3, and I'm going to pick out who's the one I'm going to vote for, or I like best. And their other 2 choices in their heads, second and third, they don't get to express that on the ballot. Ranked choice voting gets them to put what's in their head on the ballot.
And back to you, Jason.
Look, unfortunately, that image of the way voters work and voters think about things is something that is quite common amongst election reformers, and that goes to the point I made at the very beginning of my presentation. Which, again, sadly, I'm somebody who's like that. And I'm a politics nerd. I love elections. I think about these things all the time. But study after study shows us most voters just don't do that, right? And people like us, people who are interested in election reform, we do. And so it's hard for us to conceive, people who attend meetings like this, it's hard for us to understand how most, especially voters who are not your regular, maybe younger voters, newer voters, people, foreign language, all kinds of reasons why people find it harder to vote. I want their votes to be counted. I think everyone should vote. But if we make it more complicated, it's going to turn off some of them no matter what. It's going to happen. And we should take that seriously, right? And especially when we don't have party labels or lots of money or whatever, and we have huge long ballots, this will make voting more complicated, period. Now, again, it may be worth it. A lot of people say it is. I sometimes think it is. Sometimes I think it's not. And someone asked about the kind of version of this, and that's more prevalent in places like Ireland, what's called the proportional, it's called STV, single transferable vote. That actually can work when you have multi-member districts and party systems that people can use to help, because people can rank their parties usually pretty well, right? But that's not what we have in the United States, and it's not what we have in the United States municipal elections, especially. And so that's why I think that kind of image of voters is going to ignore the cost to some people who will be turned off by this kind of process.
Well, proportional ranked choice voting is a candidate-based system. People rank the candidates irrespective of what party they happen to be. And they can cross party lines when they rank the candidates. That's the system Ireland uses to elect their lower house of parliament.
So I think it's about time we probably could do a summary of the advantages and the disadvantages of, since the ranked choice voting is our topic here. Would you like to speak? Let's speak first to the disadvantages of ranked choice voting. Just a summary. Some bullet points.
You asking me or you asking me?
Yes, for you, Jason.
Okay, so I'm sorry. I think it makes voting a little bit more complicated for people. They don't have, in many places, they don't have to rank, candidates. They can just choose one. So, not everyone. I think it makes it people a little bit harder to understand the vote tally process, right? I still get questions that people think that it takes a long time to do the ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting tally process, but it doesn't, right? It's because in California, we want mail-in ballots to count and election day votes. We want to get all the votes counted as many as possible. But I think people have some confusion about that. And so I worry about that sort of thing. In terms of the positives, like I say, I do think candidates feel the incentive to build some alliances sometime. Now, we're not seeing that very much in San Francisco. I think there's a lot of reasons why candidates are reluctant to say, hey, vote for me second, because they want to be first, right? But once eventually they decide that they're probably not going to be able to be first, then they may start doing that sort of cooperative campaigning. I think there might be some advantages to that. It's still to be determined. So that idea of more cooperative campaigning is probably the one that I think is the most pro benefit of ranked choice voting that we've seen so far. Yeah.
Okay, and Steve, would you like to speak to the advantages? And if you could also address one more question that came up during the conversation earlier. The length of time that people have been using the ranked choice voting method seems to be related to their acceptance and their happiness with it. At least some of the people who have been using it in outside the United States have commented on that. So could you include that in your comments?
Well, I will try. By the way, in San Francisco, the very first time ranked choice voting was used in San Francisco, 3 candidates did campaign jointly, cooperatively. It was so unusual that the New York Times did a story on that in their paper. They didn't win. It wasn't successful for them. And more recently, when London Breed was first running for mayor, Mark Leno and Jane Kim ran a cooperative campaign where they each cross-endorsed the other, hoping that one of them would win. It didn't work, but it does create that. It creates the possibility for that dynamic, which you do not see in single choice elections in primaries with people cross-endorsing each other, where they're all fighting to be, I got to be in the top 2, otherwise I'm not going to make the runoff election. In Santa Clara County, basically it's about getting rid of the low turnout primary for county offices and just having it in the having all the candidates run in November when you have most of the voters voting. Now, ranked choice voting is not perfect, but the advantages of dropping the primary, I think, make it well worthwhile for Santa Clara County. Now, I like to.
Are there any downsides to dropping the primary? I'm curious. I'm actually. Do you think there's any downsides to eliminating that primary?
There are people who will argue that winnowing the field to 2 gives voters an ability to take a closer look at those 2 candidates that make the runoff. But 75% of the time, the field isn't winnowed to 2. One person is elected. So the rest of the electorate doesn't even get to get to consider them. But people do make that argument. And the other thing is sometimes, when Larry Stone first ran for assessor, in the primary, he came in first with 22% of the vote. Ernie Conyu came in second with 20% of the vote. So together, they accounted for 42% of the vote, which means that the 58%, a majority of the voters, really would have liked to have seen someone else make the runoff, but they didn't. It was Ernie Conyu versus Larry Stone in that runoff, which Larry Stone then ran. So it's important, I think, to have the entire field of candidates be presented to the largest electorate possible, which is in November elections. I was in a presentation that included a ranked choice voting skeptic the other day who was really concerned about voter turnout, and we got to do more to increase turnout in the primaries. And she's been working on that issue for decades. And what finally convinced her to drop her skepticism about ranked choice voting and convince that the county should switch to it is this fact that, yes, 75% of the elections are determined in these low turnout primaries, and you can't fight human nature. There are just a lot of people that don't want to vote, don't get excited enough to vote in a primary, where they do get excited to turn out in November. I do want to say in terms of perfect electoral systems, but perfect electoral systems are like perpetual motion machines. They don't exist, but that doesn't stop people from trying to invent them.
I have one more question. In ranked choice voting, let's say, like in one of our local elections, we may have up to 10 candidates on the ballot for one office. And going through that process of weeding through and re-ranking is going to take a long time. What kind of timeframes can we look at for the use of this process? Is it
we're an all-mail ballot county. Everyone gets a sample ballot and a ballot in the mail. Most people fill out their ballots at home. So you're studying, there's candidate statements. You can pay attention to your mailbox, the flood of mail that you get in the mailbox. I tend to put those in the recycling pile right away. But you can take a look at the editorials in the newspapers for the high-profile elections. You can go to candidate forums that the League of Women Voters puts on. I highly recommend those. And you learn a lot about the candidate, and you can realize, well, these aren't really serious candidates. These are perennials. They're always running. I'm not going to worry about them. These are the serious candidates. I've got to decide who I like. And I've got a hard time determining between these two people. Which of these two people do I really want to support? Well, ranked choice voting gives you a way out. Well, I'm going to vote for this person first and this person second. And also, we didn't talk about organizations that do endorsements. There are a lot of organizations out there that endorse candidates, and sometimes their membership gets divided. Do we endorse candidate A or endorse candidate B? Ranked choice voting allows them to say, hey, we like both A and B, rank them 1 and 2. The order you choose is up to you, but please rank them 1 and 2 because we like them both. And we find a lot of organizations that do put out endorsements like ranked choice because it gives them that opportunity.
Yeah, interestingly, and Carol has a great question in the chat, but interestingly, in the current San Francisco election, so what happens is candidates adapt to these rules, right? And a lot of the candidates are pushing for sole endorsements. And so there's a lot of pressure on these groups now to not put out a kind of slate endorsement. And that's something that actually makes me sad. Right? I think these groups should be doing that, but there's pressure from the politicians and from other groups in the system to not do that, because again, this is about who wins. And my major point on all this is that we should be careful about changing our rules if we want to change who wins, right? Now, again, that's not, I don't want to be, I'm not naive there, right? But like, for instance, the Electoral College, let's get rid of it. But the idea of the history of voting in cities, is riddled with this idea. Let's change rules so that our preferred candidates can win as opposed to other candidates, right? And it always leads to negative consequences, right? And so this idea of spoiler effect, which Carol brought up in the chat, and I think I want to ask Carol to define the term there, because I know a couple different ways to think about that. As I understand it, you're thinking about like what happened in Maine, where the Republican governor won even though because there was 2 Democratic candidates, right? And he was elected, and that was a system where you didn't need a majority to win. It would have been easily defeated by a majority runoff type system, or even a top 2 primary like we have here in California. So, it can be a problem. But I will say that there are some really complex ways in which ranked choice voting can also create some kind of spillover effects. There's something called that people in my field call the middle squeeze, and it's sort of a thought process. But the order in which candidates are eliminated, when you have close tallies, so someone's finishing 4th and then 3rd, someone close between 3rd and 4th, or 2nd and 3rd, it could be the difference between a few votes. That can be a pretty random process. But if one candidate is eliminated before another, it can actually change who wins, because if their preferred voters, right, go predominant to one candidate than another. Now, again, this is part of the process. I'm not saying this is illegitimate, but I've seen it come very close to happening a few times. It actually did happen in one of our supervisors' races here in San Francisco. It could happen this time around. And so ranked choice voting doesn't.
It's very interesting.
Kind of effect.
Very interesting comments, Jason. But I am afraid we are out of time. And I want to thank both of you. And also I want to thank the folks who helped us do this event. The League of Women Voters Civil Discourse team of Santa Clara County. All of you who joined us tonight, which I'm sure you learned a fantastic amount about more than one type of voting system, and all of the Santa Clara County leagues. And I think one of the things that I'm seeing from your comments is the real secret is to get everybody who can vote out there to vote, using whatever system that we have in place. So thank you again. And I want you to remember that this League of Women Voters has a series of events on the election coming up. We have our candidate forums, which we record for both school boards and city councils, as well as our pro-cons, which address the ballot issues. And we talk about the things that happen when you vote for them and the things that happen when you vote against them. And all of these events will be recorded and posted for your voting pleasure. Thank you again.